So, hello everyone. A big warm welcome. And no, you're not hallucinating. I'm not Rahul Kanwal. Rahul, due to some last minute problems, couldn't be with us today. I'm Manika Raikwar, and as you can see, I have a distinguished panel of guests with me today. Their views and your questions will form the basis of putting forth some key issues that hopefully Budget 2021 will address. This is the first budget after independence that's coming after such a massive contraction of growth. It's a budget that comes after a year of corona, a year of economic despair. So, can it really be a budget of hope for lakhs around this country? Can this budget finally prioritize the policies, the issues that truly matter to the people? I have with me today Indermit Singh Gill, non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, Shweta Rajpal Kohli, an old colleague and friend, but now, of course, here as the head of public policy for Sequoia Capital, India and Southeast Asia. Yamini Aiyar, the president and chief executive, Center for Policy Research. Nidhi, Razdan, senior journalist and former executive editor of NDTV. Bharat, who's the president of GITAM, the Dean University. Sridhar Pabbisetty, the founder of Kautilya School of Public Policy, and Prateek, also the co-founder of Kautilya. If I can quickly start, and it's a question for everyone across, briefly, if you can tell me about the key challenge, according to you, in front of the government, in front of the finance minister, as she prepares this year's budget. Shweta, if I can start with you.
Sure, Manika, it's of course a very, very challenging time for the government, and nobody would like to be in the shoes of policymakers right now, especially coming out of a year that has seen, massive, growth hit, as we can call it. But of course, it's a challenge that was faced not just by the Indian government, but by governments across the world. So, Manika, when you're trying to balance objectives of new generation and spurring growth, it's always hard because on one hand, you do not have the funds to put in to spur that growth and provide that much needed stimulus. And on the other hand, that is the need of the hour, because ultimately what everybody is looking for is that necessary stimulus to provide growth. Having said that, I would say that the government has done its bit in the last 1 year, and tons of announcements that came bang in the middle of the lockdown were much needed, whether it is, expanding the definition of MSMEs, or it is a fund of fund for MSMEs, or it is tons of other initiatives that the government took to obviously provide that much needed relief were obviously welcome. But was it enough? Probably not. Are we going to see some sort of recovery setting in, and what can the budget do to spur it? I think this is going to be that moment and that budget that everyone's going to look forward to. Now, there's a divided view. Many would actually say that a lot has already happened, and that's why the government's hands are tied and the tools are limited to do a lot more in this budget. Because at the end of the day, as we said, that you have to keep the fiscal deficit in mind, you have to keep the budget deficit in mind, and there are credit rating agencies that are always watching these numbers. So to expect every budget to simply dole out sops and give out giveaways to every sector is wishful thinking. And that's why we should temper our expectations and not expect it to be a please all budget. On the other hand, there are many others who think that the government will use this opportunity to make sure there are some big bang announcements, because this is that moment. Because if we lose that opportunity, we're not going to be able to get this opportunity very quickly again to get what many are calling different shapes of recovery. So is it going to be a K-shaped recovery? Will it be a V-shaped recovery? So, the jury is out there on what we're going to see. I'm keeping it very high level for now, and we can dig deeper into sectors. But I think a budget with a lot of focus. But my big takeaway would be, let's temper expectations down, because hands are tied.
I think Shweta set a very safe platform, at least for the government. But Mr. Gill, if I can come to you, and taking from what Shweta just said, of course, what you think is the biggest challenge, but also she made a very interesting point, because perhaps now more than ever, India's challenge will be to ensure growth, but at the same time, also make sure there is equity and participation for all its people. Mr. Gill, you're on mute.
So I completely agree with Shweta, actually, and I think that the government is in a tough place here. But one has to keep two or three things in mind. The first one is, if you look at the record of the government in terms of big bang reforms, I think it hasn't been very good. So that's one thing I would keep in mind if I was the finance minister. I wouldn't do a big bang budget because the record of the government for big bang things is not good. That doesn't mean you shouldn't make a bang. It should just be a series of small bangs, not one big bang. Okay, one. I mean, if you take a look at the biggest bang reform that was made in the last year, right? And that was the lockdown. It was too big a reform. It was too soon. It was too severe, and it was too sloppily implemented, right? So I think one of the things, and there is no fiscal policy that can offset a 25% decrease in GDP. There is no fiscal policy, right? And exactly as Shweta said, I don't think that the government has a fiscal room to do it. The public debt to GDP ratio is close to 100% now, right? The second thing is that I guess if you look at the room for monetary policy, you don't have much room for monetary policy either. Inflation is close to the upper bound for the RBI. It's close to 6%, right? So I think that the government has done rather well under the constraints that it has. I think it has done rather well under the constraint that it has faced so far. When I looked at the last budget, I found that was a very sensible budget. Okay, so in a sense, what the government has to do is to moderate expectations, don't do big bang type of things, and try to do a budget that is essentially a do no harm budget. Okay, so I will keep it at this level for now, and then I can give you more details along the way.
Right. Yamini, if I can come to you, again, what do you think is the biggest challenge? But I remember an article that you wrote in June, and if I could just refer to it, interestingly, you said in that, that India cannot repair and reform without acknowledging failures. And I thought that was a very interesting take on India's economy and the way we move forward. So if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Sure, thanks. I think, the biggest challenge that the government has confronted, in fact, since NDA came back into power 2019, has been the problem of employment. And that problem is only getting sharper and much, much more severe consequent to the lockdown. If you look at where the economy stands today, the fact that listed firms have seen recovery, but small firms, medium enterprises have not seen recovery. In fact, wages are being cut. This is perhaps one of the first times in which an economic shock is being responded to with improvements in listed firms rather than the small and medium enterprises sector really leading the force. So to my mind, the crisis that this budget has to address head on, and by the way, this was exactly the same crisis in July of 2019. It was exactly the same crisis in February of 2020 that we have been confronting and that have not been adequately addressed. This is what this should be the epicenter around which policy needs to be built. And that actually leads to the argument I had made back in June. I think if there's one thing that the lockdown really brought out in sharp relief was the fact that we have always thought of economic growth as a pathway that has to be determined with trade-offs between growth and welfare. The fact that we had perhaps the largest movement of people in the early days after the lockdown, which has completely displaced the labor market in ways that will probably take a decade to recover from, should be a reminder that growth that doesn't actually, where welfare is not constitutive of growth, and that does not address the true challenge of informal employment, will never be effective growth. It's increasingly now it has become commonplace to say the gains of 1991 have reached their limits. We have to talk about human capital. We must recognize that that's not something that can be evolved sequentially. Real growth is growth that builds itself on human capital. level. And in fact, the pandemic really brought that out in sharp relief. So employment should be the epicenter. Everything else we do should be built around that. That includes thinking of a welfare policy and the longer structural challenge of building human capital.
You know, that's a really important point, and I actually want to continue with you on that for a second, but let me first welcome Mohan Naidu. Ram, welcome. Ram, of course, is a TDP MP and joins us today. But Yamini, just to come back to you, and you made that point about welfare, and again, there is that huge debate of the trade-off between welfare and growth, where welfare is almost an afterthought. And again, I think you have spoken about this earlier, but I wanted to, especially at a time like this, where people have lost jobs and there is so much unemployment, how can we get robust welfare and have policies to back that?
So I think the one thing that has saved India over these last 10 months has been the fact that we actually have a robust public distribution system and Narega. Two things that, if you look back to our debates 10 years ago, we argued was SOPs, better to take a helicopter and drop cash. And in fact, in times of stress, it is this that has formed the backbone. There's lots to be done to reform it, but it formed the backbone and it ensured that we didn't have hunger and that the rural economy survived and actually fueled a certain degree of recovery for the economy. The question that really has been brought out through this pandemic is that our welfare structure is very limited just to preventive measures. So for the poorest of the poor, for the rural economy, we've never considered what adequate welfare for urban India means, and particularly for informal workers who are the ones that have suffered most. The fact that shutting down the economy, even for 2 weeks, people did not have enough savings to be able to manage basic food in those 2 weeks. All the early surveys from the lockdown told us that more than 65% of informal workers didn't have enough saving for food for more than one meal within 2 weeks of not working. Tells you how limited a safety net we have. So we actually have to be talking about a robust, inclusive social safety net, one that ensures it covers the poorest of the poor, which we do reasonably well, but also addresses the reality of the World Bank has defined 50% of India as what it calls vulnerable population. So it's not poor, but one single income shock will push you down to poverty. And that means that we have to think about a combination of safety nets that include urban workers. One argument on the table is something like an urban version of Narega, an urban employment program, but also contributory social insurance programs linked to employment that will ensure that there is some cushioning to those who lose jobs. One last point I did want to make, I do think that even though the government has done lots of things, the reality is that the Indian lockdown was the most stringent and India's relief package has been the most parsimonious, if I could use that word, across all countries. And in many ways, the demand challenge that we are going to confront now as we slowly hit recovery is really a consequence of far too much focus on the impact on credit rating agencies. This is probably the first time in all the years that I have followed public policy that Bombay is saying you should do income transfers. I mean, really, how often do you hear Bombay saying it's a great idea to do income transfers and it'll actually help the Indian economy? This is when we should have been generous. We chose not to. The employment challenge we are confronting is a consequence of that lack of generosity. It's in some senses a policy-made problem, not a pandemic-made problem.
And policy and public policy is what we're all interested in, and we're going to talk a lot more about that. But Ram, let me come to you, and taking from what Yamini said, the government could well turn around and say, it's been a year, yes, there's been unemployment and a lot of people need a lot of help, but also it's been a year that has seen extremely low tax collections. Now, where does the government look for money or raise money in a recession year budget?
Definitely, that's a very interesting question that's been, posed to the central government also right now. And the first thing that you see is the tax collections. But like most of the economists or most of the intellectuals, they've all suggested that tax is not the first thing that you look at this point of time. But there are monetization of resources that you can look at, especially when you come to the government resources, especially the lands that you have or different kinds of assets that you have. That is one area that you can definitely look at. Being a parliamentarian, I would definitely not suggest going after the PSUs. There are some PSUs which might seem to be not functioning too well, but I would stress the government to take care of them rather than trying to sell them. But there are other resources that can be monetized to cover up for the dearth in the tax collections. And other than that, you see that the GST is also improving. GST for the last December has been the highest since it has been launched. So definitely GST collections seem to be going up. So if you facilitate the trade and demand, if you facilitate the economy to be robust, to be performing well, then automatically the tax collections with the present scenario of things should be able to manage. And probably the other suggestion that I would give is the fiscal deficit, maybe trying to tweak it up a little bit. The central government has been trying to get it down over the past few years, but this is a time probably to explore that option also, so that they can have that cushion, so to get more flow of resources.
Right. Nidhi, let me come to you. And before we discuss the big challenges of the government, let's address the big elephant in the room. This is your first public appearance in India after, I have to say, your awful traumatic experience. I'm not going to ask you, aapko kaisa lagta hai, or how you're feeling. But if there was something that you could say to people, because I think you're one of many, because you're a public figure, it came out and sort of you were brave enough to sort of come out about it first, but there are many people. So, if there was something that you could say to people so that they could save themselves from this, what would it be?
Well, all I can say is that it has been a pretty traumatic week, and I'm still dealing with the after effects of what has happened. But I will, and I have, I think, already learned quite a few lessons from this. And one of the reasons I went public, although there were quite a few people who told me not to, people close to me, who said, just let it go, nobody's ever going to know, why do you want to go public? Well, I just never wanted to lie, and I wanted to be upfront about it, because I felt that was the right thing to do. And I think that if there is anyone who can learn from my experience, even one person who can learn from that, I would be very happy. And my only advice to people would be that nothing on the internet is what it seems. Even conversations with seemingly real people, even online, are not what they seem. So just be very careful. I never realized, for instance, that even downloading a PDF file on your email could be malware. And I know that today, what looks like just a regular PDF. So just basic things like that. The fact that there are a lot of things that are synced, your passwords to different websites, and that's how people get into your system, and they know exactly what you're doing, what you're writing, what you're reading, and they profile you. This was a revelation to me about just how much of our personal information is out there on the internet, and that can easily sort of be hijacked. So I would advise people to be very, very vigilant about that and take that seriously. So that really honestly is the only thing I hope that my horrible experience is able to help even any one other person be saved from something like this.
Well, more power for you, for being so brave. But now to quickly move on to what we're discussing today, it's the budget and policies. I wanted to ask that you're part of the Kautilya school, you're on the advisory board, and here we're sort of focusing on formal education for public policies. And at a time like this, why do you think that's important?
I think, well, firstly, I'm no expert on the budget. I've never claimed to be, even as a news anchor. I'm coming to you today really from a perspective of a professional, a salaried professional my whole life, and what I would like to see the government do. But just from firstly a public policy perspective, I think that, look, India is on the cusp of something big, and this could be our century, but we're really not there yet, and we are being held back for many reasons. And the pandemic is just one of them. I don't think we're able to realize our full potential just yet. So I think the next few decades are going to be very important in terms of establishing our own public policy structures to train our own bureaucrats, officials, others, to frame policies in a way that are unique to India and that can help us realize our fullest potential. So I think this is the right time to sort of take this formal public policy education, take it to the next level, so that India can realize it's going to take some decades to do that. But if India invests in it now, We don't need to look at Western institutions to tell us how we need to make India truly great and make this India's century. So I think that's where the importance of sort of public policy education comes in. And just as a lay person, I want to say that I really hope that in this budget, everyone's talked about creating jobs, etc. That's obviously, I agree with Yamini Aiyar there, that has to be the central focus. But I think as a salaried professional, one would really hope that we all get a bit of a tax break. It's been a really tough time. It is the middle class salaried professional who pays the most taxes. Some people who are on the higher end of the tax bracket find themselves in the same tax bracket as multi-billionaires in this country. And I'm not going to go into specific names, you know what I mean. So they end up paying like literally the same tax. So we need to cast the tax net wider, and people who've been honestly paying taxes and paying a lot of them. It's time to think about us and what the government can do for us. It's been a terrible year for the middle class and for ordinary folks.
It's very interesting that you say that. And again, I please everyone, this is for everyone across the board, come in. There is being a huge case being made for tax cut for individuals because they're saying that's also going to drive the economy. There'll be more stimulus, put money in the hands of the people. But at the same time, the government turns and says, you want us to give you infrastructure. Where is the money going to come from? What is that sweet spot? And is this the year where the government says, okay, we're going to be good big brothers and here is more money, have that. Yamini, Mr. Gill, Shweta.
Yeah, happy to jump in here, and I think that seems to be the big elephant in the room. How do you make sure that you're spurring consumer demand? You're putting more money in the hands of people, more disposable income that will in turn lead to the cycle of creating demand and fueling the economy. But at the same time, just reminding that we're staring at a fiscal deficit of 7% as against the target of 3.5%. Those are real numbers, and even if we stop worrying about credit rating agencies, those aren't pretty numbers for any government to look at. Yes, GST has been a silver lining for sure, but overall revenue receipts and tax collections have been very, very poor. And whenever you're caught in this recessionary cycle, it becomes harder to justify doing all of the kind of tax benefits that individuals are expecting in a budget year like this. So I would say it's a very hard call. It's a very tough call. And while everyone is expecting that to happen, I think my sense is that the government will continue to focus on what has been its policy throughout the lockdown, which is to spur investments and have domestic manufacturing get that necessary fillip. That has been the whole premise of Atmanirbhar Bharat as a philosophy. The PLI incentives that the government's been doing, the kind of investments they've been putting into domestic manufacturing, and geopolitics driving a lot of that decision making in policy as well. So I think all of that will come together to see a greater focus on domestic manufacturing, which the government believes will in turn lead to job generation and then also spur demand. So my sense is, as I said, that we should really taper down our expectations of too many tax benefits coming our way in terms of individuals and salaried class.
Right. Before I sort of go into other sectors like education, health, etc., I did want to sort of focus on something that has been, I think we all knew it for years, has been a massive revelation and a very, very big pain point for all of us. And that's the health sector. Coming a year after this, where one thought, every little pain point, I think, was really revealed. So isn't this time that we started spending perhaps a little more than 1.5% of the GDP on the health sector, Mr. Gill?
So we've been actually working on this. And the thing that you have to, the thing that you have to keep in mind, Manika, is that the spending is done at the state level. So you have to have spending capacity. So until now, at least, actually money is returned from the states back to the center because they cannot spend it on worthwhile projects. So basically, I think you're absolutely right that we should be spending much more than 1.5%. We should be trying to double that over the next 2 or 3 years. But it won't happen right away. Otherwise, you'll just start to waste money. And there is no money to waste. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I think, I guess if I were in the position of the finance minister, what would I do? Right? So one of the things that I would do is I would set realistic expectations. You're talking about the union budget. You're not talking about the entire economy as a whole. The central government budget is a small part of the national economy, at the most 10% of GDP, right? And there are lots of things that she cannot change. So I think that the first one is that I think that she should have been trying to make sure that people pay less attention to what she says, not more attention. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think that the government has been hesitant to open these fiscal spigots by borrowing and spending. And that's for a good reason, because you cannot ignore the markets. You're already at a very top, you're at a very precarious position of debt to GDP of about 90%. You're not getting very good terms for this debt either. It's okay terms, it's not great terms. And the worst part of it is that the public debt dynamics are very adverse. They've been rising at around 10 percentage points of GDP every year, even before the pandemic, okay? So that's not a good thing. The second thing, as I said, is that it shouldn't be printing money, because otherwise you'll get inflation, and inflation brings down governments, okay? Inflation always does, okay? So then you say, okay, so what does the government have actually? Now, it has a few things. The first one is, if you look at private sector debt in India, that's not very high. It's actually quite moderate. It's about 55%, 55%. And I think that the government strategy to try to sort of make credit more accessible to small, medium, and micro enterprises was a good one. And I think that it's actually working. At least state banks have started to sort of open the spigots a little bit for them and so on. And you're starting to see that recovery. And to those small, medium, and micro enterprises, you'll get jobs there, right? So you get private sector jobs. I completely agree with the thing that you also should be using public works programs and so on. But those are things, those are small measures, I think, right? I think the big measures are these, right? The second thing is that the government also owns a sizable amount of assets in the form of state-owned enterprises. And many of these state-owned enterprises are not doing particularly well. So I think the government strategy to try to raise revenues through some disinvestment, whether it's railways or whether it's Air India or whether it's the LIC and so on, I think that's a good strategy. And I think it should sort of continue to push. It should. Now, I think it's mostly failed to actually do this, but it doesn't mean that it should not continue to keep trying. And then the third thing, I think the most important thing is, of course, you want to get growth going, right? And one of the things about the Indian economy, which is an asset for the government in many ways, is that it's a very inefficient economy. So there are lots of reforms that they can do, and they've been trying to do this. There will be labor reform, farming reform, and so on. That you have to liberalize these things. I think it's mostly failed because it's always put these things as big bang reforms, right? And I think it's time for the government to just take a stock of all these things that it has tried earlier and actually try to finish those reforms, right? And if it does that, I think that will think. Now, I completely agree that India has a huge infrastructure deficit. India also has a financing problem there. But there are ways to get infrastructure financing. It'll not be the same size as people want. But you can start to tap the resources of the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, you have the AIIB, you have the BRICS Bank, you have all of this money with which it can actually start to sort of help to improve the loan portfolios of the state governments, create some fiscal space, and make some good infrastructure investments. I think there's a lot that government can do, but it's a series of small bangs, not one big bang.
Right. And like I said, I want to touch upon many sectors, whether it's startups or, what we can do for migrant labor. But we've started getting questions from our audience, and I want to take one because that's an area that Kautilya is working in. And Prateek, if you can take that. Anonymous attendee asks, we're talking about budget allocations, but not focusing on budget utilizations. Is there any need to train our government departments or officials on how to utilize these funds?
I think actually that's a very nice question, and I'll sort of share an example. of recent policy work which I was working on. So every year, government allocates 25 lakh rupees per district for Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao. These are central grants given directly to the district magistrate without any state interferences to use on Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao. Now, it requires, like, most of you must be aware on the panel, that any policy which is a central policy requires a plan before utilization, right? So even if your Jawaharlal Nehru Urban Renewal Mission, it will require a plan. If you're not able to utilize the money will go back. So most of the DMs are not able to even develop a plan of action of how to utilize that money. And that money goes back to the central government, right? And when we talk about, Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, even an awareness campaign in your own districts at small level, in pockets where girls don't go to school, can be super effective in getting those vulnerable populations back into the school, right? And here I wanted to talk about budget utilization in general, right? Where do you want to put in your money in a year where you have shortfall, right? I would say let's go back to basics. We had made a lot of gains over the last 2 decades on gross enrollment ratio. We've been able to put our students back into school. Our students are there in school, right? But unfortunately, with this pandemic, with these school closures for a year, what has happened is most of these students, the vulnerable population, as Yamini was talking about, may not come back to school. And even in the vulnerable lens, look at the girls who've had the most impact of poverty and patriarchy during the pandemic is on the vulnerable section of girl child in India, right? Now, we due to Kailash Satyarthi's work in India, child labor and your child trafficking had come down to levels in which you could manage them. But the fear amongst the section of bureaucrats and the state governments is that again child trafficking, child marriages, child labor would be on the increase because students are no longer in school, right? And it's so funny that all of us are talking on Zoom, but imagine the digital divide in places where our respected MP here, Ram Mohan, could shed some light. I mean, villages do not have that facility to even sort of do basic 3G, 2G work, right? And there you're expecting government to deliver education, right, at scale, right? Imagine if this becomes a perpetual thing. We are hit by pandemics or by bird flus or stuff like this, and schooling, it gets affected. You wasted 1 year of child's education, right? And I would say if money has to be smartly put, I would bridge that digital divide, take internet deep, penetrate into the last village. Service delivery will improve, last mile delivery failures will improve, will be sorted out, education will be delivered at scale, and at least you will put your young population to productive work, right? If they're sitting idle at home, the chances of them getting put into child marriage, child trafficking, child labor is increasing. Plus, look at the immunizations. Immunizations have stopped, right? The biggest challenge the country faced was we couldn't immunize our children, right? Nutrition, midday meal was the lender of last resort for many folks out there who go and study in school. Parents were sending children to school because they were getting at least a meal in school, right? Now that has gotten affected. Though government says door to door has been started, but it's largely due to the efforts of non-profits where it has been happening. But imagine it's not easy to deliver meals every day door to door, right? So once our school starts, we need to focus on health, nutrition of the children, check the children up for all the diseases which probably would have caused stunting and wasting. All these things need to be checked at the school level, and health and education ministry needs to come together, and we need to slowly but steadily work towards ensuring each and every village in this country is connected with high speed internet and has at scale education can be delivered in this country. So that is sort of my answer to that question and to the question of where the utilization needs to happen.
Right, and also in terms when we look at funds, and Yamini spoke about creating jobs, and Ram spoke about what is really needed and where you can get money from. But Ram and Yamini, if you can come in, I really did want to speak about migrant laborers. That was just another horrific story that sort of showed us in the pandemic really about who we are, and this this other this section of people that does India really care about them. And yes, people have gotten back to work, and slowly there are jobs being created, and work is happening. But what more can be done for these people, and how can we sort of through the year ensure that their families are looked after?
So can I
Yeah,
first couple of things. One, I just wanted to go back to the question that Prateek was responding to a minute earlier. One of the big challenges that India confronts is its very, very weak public finance management system. The reality of the Indian balance sheet is that lots of allocations are made. The nature of our auditing and expenditure cycle is such that actual expenditure is only reported at a 2-year lag. When we comment on budget, we never ask about expenditure. We're just looking at allocations and debating the issue. And unspent balances are a huge problem. By one estimate of the CAG, India has 1.75 lakh crore unspent balances floating in bank accounts all across the country. The reasons for these unspent balances are long and complex, related to state capacity and particularly a lot of administrative red tape. And also because we allocate little, so expenditures become much harder to perform. So I think that the most important thing we need to do in this budget to address part of the fiscal challenge is to really take expenditure management seriously and to start moving towards expenditure management reform. Unlocking unspent balances will open up a lot more and in fact build credibility of the Indian state so that when we talk about more taxation or less taxation, when we talk about more allocations, there's some credibility to that allocation. And that's, I think, should be one of the front and center issues that we need to debate. To the question of migrant labor, I think one of the two most disappointing aspects of what the country went through, as particularly in those difficult months of March and April, is that the challenge confronting migrant workers has not translated into a political shift or even a political demand for an improved social contract. And the fact that we went into a lockdown that had widespread elite consensus because we don't believe in the capability of our public health system has reduced itself into politics over vaccines rather than a serious debate about strengthening the primary health system and building a strong public health system. And I think that it is, even though budgets as speeches should not, is not the be end and end all of public policy, should never be. And we know particularly the politics of this government is such that budget decisions actually always happen after the budget speech is made in multiple press conferences. It has symbolic value, and as symbolic value for the budget to signal its commitment to addressing these two things is really crucial. This means particularly, I think, universalizing the public distribution system. One nation, one ration card is A, not yet even near completion despite the March 2021 deadline. B, it doesn't resolve the fundamental problem of a demand-based public distribution system that is accessible to all. Most states that have reformed their public distribution systems have done it by going towards near universalization. It has huge value. And secondly, by signaling a commitment to strengthening the social protection architecture. I know at the back end, a lot of work is now being done at the Government of India level to improve the governance of social protection, which is basically about social safety nets for informal workers in particular, and bringing the states on board. I think Indermit talked about the fact that a lot of this is about the states. One of the big challenges of the pandemic is that it's centralized approaches to response, which is exactly the opposite of what we needed. We needed a decentralized approach. Health, social protection are all state subjects. And in fact, the balance sheets of state governments are in a real mess. And the central government has done everything it can to centralize its economic response rather than using its monetary and fiscal tools to empower states. So the Finance Commission report will also be tabled simultaneously to the budget in many more important ways. I think the Finance Commission report is going to shape fiscal policy and have a huge impact. And I'm hoping to see at least us maintaining good devolution for states and recognizing that this has to be spearheaded at the state level. What the center has to do is to be able to coordinate this. And that also is part and parcel of a budgetary function that can be done effectively with good expenditure management reforms. So
I just wanted to just jump in here based on a couple of things. Yeah, excellent. Very well articulated, Yamini Aiyar. And I think also the point is that I've never understood this obsession with making, the budget day and the budget speech the big focus of the year as far as economic policy is concerned. I never understood the railway budget being a separate entity and then the main budget. And it was so great that the railway budget thing was finally set aside, because economic reform, economic policy, I think this is something that needs to keep happening throughout the year. And let's not, I mean, it's what Shweta said at the beginning about lowering expectations. We all have too many expectations built around that 90-minute speech, which shouldn't be the case. And in the last couple of years, we've seen the finance minister make speeches in parliament and have everything, clarified and unravel over the course of the next week, because there's so much confusion and it just goes into so much minutiae. So I think we need to just get, sort of take this budget speech off the pedestal. I wish this government could do that and make it a routine thing rather than this big event. Also, what Yamini Aiyar talked about in terms of spending on public health, again, as just a common citizen, I really hope that COVID was a wake-up call for all of us, for all state governments, for the center as well, about our public health systems. I am thankful that India did not face the kind of mortality or the kind of devastation that Europe faced or even the US is facing today with this pandemic. We may not even know the real extent to which it hit us. But I think that as a citizen, I really hope that there is that kind of attention that's paid to our public health system. It's really sad today. I mean, I know someone who needed surgery for a back tumor, and AIMS told him he's not going to get a bed for 6 months. This is someone who could die in the next 60 days. So I really hope that if nothing else, they spend money on this.
Very important points there, but I just wanted to come to Ram, taking from what Yamini said, and that's the whole issue of federalism as well, of letting states decide for themselves. Ram, what can states, I mean, as a TDP MP, I mean, what can states expect from this budget?
Well, first of all, I think the states expect some sort of confidence from the central government or some sort of assurance. Why I say this is because recently how things have turned out after the pandemic, especially regarding the GST distribution to the states. The word force majeure was used, which didn't seem to be very appropriate. And states were facing their own troubles. And it was their right to look up to the center in times of distress so that they can come to help. But the center lifting their hands up and saying that, okay, we are also in this kind of stress and we can't do anything, doesn't seem to be the right answer. So definitely in this budget, at least, the states will be looking for proper compensation to handle the health crisis that each state is facing, or the economic crisis, because each state has their own set of difficulties. So definitely that is one thing they would be seeing, maybe GST compensation. And also considering the southern states, the 15th Finance Commission also seems to be a little bit neglecting the finances towards the southern states. So that is somewhere where I would see that there will be proper compensation again to the states in the south. And maybe another point the states would be looking for is definitely in terms of health infrastructure, because the resources have been totally drained out through the pandemic. So in terms of health, even though if it's a state subject, they would be looking for proper help from the center so that they can do proper immunization, proper vaccination to each and every person when it comes to the COVID vaccine. So that is one thing. And in terms of centrally sponsored schemes, I've also seen in my last 6 years as being an MP that many of the times there seems to be a delay, or there seems to be miscommunication in terms of centrally sponsored schemes that go to the states. Even though the states are proactive in trying to utilize those funds, if the center doesn't facilitate those flow of funds at the right time, then there seems to be big problems. So though I would at least demand the center to look after these considerations, especially giving that assurance to the state, saying that, okay, I'm here as the big brother, so no need to worry, rather than saying that, okay, I'm also facing a distress, so I'll just stay away from all this. I don't think that should be the attitude of the central government, at least at this point of time.
Right. The two other sectors that I really do want to address, and one Prateek touched on briefly, was education. And Bharat, if I can come to you, it's also interestingly, it's a year where we've seen the national education policy. We've heard good things about it. But if we look at data, the last 3 years at least, the budgetary allocation for education has been shrinking every year. Now, is this the year again that we look or we just park education on the side and say probably do more for health and not so much for education?
Sure. Manika, can I speak for about a minute before I answer that question?
Okay. So as Bharat thinks for a minute, because he wants to really formulate his answer well.
I want to speak about something else.
Okay. What is it that you want to speak about? This is a, forum about the budget and about policy. So what is it that you want to speak on? We will.
It's applicable to all topics, but also applicable to the budget.
So go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you to the audience and attendees who are taking their time and listening to us. I think otherwise we could have just had a small group meeting. I appreciate you all coming and listening to us. And I think the intent of doing a session like this is to have a platform where we have diverse views and we debate about different points of view. But at the end of it, all of us takes away learning, which sometimes we're not getting in many forums. So I'm glad that we're making this happen. And the other really important thing to the attendees is that one of the biggest things that is probably a root cause of the problems is the lack of empathy in various stakeholders when they take decisions, whether it be the finance budget that is being announced or the consumer, the taxpayer, a business owner. Everyone is thinking from their lens and not as much from the lens of the decision maker or the stakeholder. So more discussions like this, I think, would build that empathy and would help us really build better decision making in the future. And why this is important is, I just want to give an example. We had one session with a retired Supreme Court judge, and all of us were really complaining that the entire judiciary is broken, this and that. And he heard everything and he said, you are the civil society, then why are you not speaking about it? Don't come and complain to me. And when we have set up a great panel like this, we've got about 100 attendees. We could have had more. But when we have something more controversial, we have millions of people expressing their views on it and commenting on it and giving their take. So that's the unfortunate state of events. So my request to the attendees is that please take whatever you get today and pass it on to the people around you if you find it useful. So that's really important. Coming to education, I think overall, similar to the health sector, I don't see much support being given to the education sector, either in terms of regulation or in terms of financial support. I think the education policy speaks a good language, but how much of that will be implemented is a big question mark, again, because education is a concurrent subject. There's both center and state that needs to decide on various aspects. Higher education, at least, GITAM being a deemed university, we have a lot more freedom than many other institutions. I wanted to reference one point that Yamini had mentioned earlier, that publicly listed entities are doing well and the other ones are falling by the wayside. I think education is no different. By virtue of being a deemed university where we have the freedom to charge tuition of our will, we are able to generate enough revenue to sail through tough times. And surprisingly, this year we have done 10% more admissions than last year, even though it is COVID year. But many other small institutions haven't been able to run classes, haven't been able to get students into the system. So the challenge for the finance budget or for the whole finance department is, how do you strengthen everybody, not only the people who are strong? Because if the outcome of COVID is the strong become stronger and the weak die, then that's not a nation that I'd like to live in. And because we're leading to anarchy, and that's a dangerous place to be. And what support education in particular is, again, another point I think that Yamini was mentioning, she was making great points, is investment into human capital. And I don't remember who the person was, one of the British leaders. If you want to destroy a nation, destroy their education. I don't think anyone is destroying our education from the outside. We're doing it to ourselves. So if we don't strengthen our foundations, maybe this is not a good year for me to ask this, because ensuring that people have food on the table and they have a house to rest under, that is probably more important right now than philosophical debates. But if we don't invest for the long term, we will face more such problems in the future. And at that point, we may not even have what we have today. So in that sense, no matter how difficult it is, even in a post-COVID era, allocating resources to development of human capital, development of financial capital for the future is essential. And for that reason, I think allocating any amount of budget and any amount of regulatory freedom to educational institutions is going to be beneficial.
You know, Bharat, you made a very interesting point about empathy. And I think if there is anything that really came out of last year, it should be that, we should all try and be more empathetic towards each other. Just going on to the point where you spoke about education, this is also a year where a lot of families are finding it very difficult to pay fees, where they're also finding it very difficult. Students are finding it difficult, and they're not being able to opt for courses of their choice. Sridhar, is this a year where the government can really sort of come forward and say, we'll make loans really easy or write off at least educational loans?
Absolutely, Manika. I think what Bharat said is very true. How can we make empathy at the center of our action this year, at least, right? And it's a great crisis, and it's a great opportunity as well. And I will, even before I get to direct answering your question, I just want to take a minute more and say, now, given that government is in the tight spot, right? I mean, revenues are reducing, expenditure expectations are increasing. What can the government do? And I think all of us should take time and reflect on and say, what is it that we would want the government to do less of what it is doing today? And I'm sure if you go around the room, we'll get 10 brilliant ideas of what are the things that government is unnecessarily doing. It has been doing for the past, and hence it's going to continue to do it like this, right? And I'll give you a few instances, right? If you look at the maxim that the present dispensation has given us, is that minimum government, maximum governance, right? And I think if you go back to that maxim and say what all can we do around that, I'll give you an example. Even to this day, there's a company which manufactures cigarettes, and one of the biggest stakeholder is Life Insurance Corporation of India, right? We all have to go back and ask, why is Life Insurance Corporation of India having 16% stake in a cigarette making company? And we all know how much government has been influencing LIC stakeholding, right? You can go back and say that, this is not necessarily a great decision, right? Secondly, if you go back and see, the government is sitting not on tax kitty, but on a cess kitty of 42,000 crores. And this is all sitting in the state building and other construction workers welfare boards, right? 42,000 crores that actually belong to the welfare of the labor, of the construction and other workers, was just locked up for many, many years and just kept on accumulating. There are people, the expenditure that if you go back and see in many states, you see that people have bought washing machines, people have bought refrigerators, people have bought inane things in the name of construction workers and their welfare. Now we need to go back and say, can we now put this cess into the right use? If we had so much money in our kitty, then why did the migrants walk back to their villages barefoot and empty on stomach? And we need to go back and make sure that what Yamini was telling earlier on is saying that basic safety net has to be put in place. The second thing that we have today is great amount of data government is sitting on in terms of taxpayers, income taxpayers, as well as GST taxpayers. The government can really see those who have been paying regularly over the last 10 years, 5 years, or how many years, and have seen a very drastic dip this year. The government should step back and say, how can I stand with these people who have been consistent payers over the many years and then stand along with them and through this tough time. These are all very, very targeted interventions the government can do based on very credible data it already has, right? Next, going back onto the regulated cholesterol that's blockaging all our employment creating opportunities. Manufacturing sector, even in MSME, can get inspected by 20 inspectors, right? When will these guys go do it, get business and deliver more orders, right? The government action has to come down and move from, no, you can't do that, to say, okay, how can I help you do better, right? These are the basic shifts that have to be the cornerstone of us translating that empathy to saying that let's become a better governed society, right? Now, coming to the direct question that you had about saying that what is the way in which the government can stand next to the students, right? One, it's been a difficult year. How can the government come in and say, okay, all these education loans that you people have taken, especially if you're graduating, then how can I kind of give you a moratorium for your paying back of these installments, right? The second important thing is saying that many developed countries actually stand by the students and help them in that journey to go get their advanced degrees, become better educated, become more employable, right? One thing that as we speak, the government through the national education policy intends to double the gross enrollment ratios in higher education, which means that the government is very keen to push 3 crore people into higher educational institutions. And we need to go back and see how many of them can afford going into this higher education system. And if that's the case, how can government mop up enough support, enough these things, and make it available to these students at very affordable rates, right? If you go look at Germany and many other countries, they make it so much easier for students to make that choice to go back into education. If we go back to the informal sector today and talk to a plumber, mason, and electrician who is entering into the job sector or who has spent 2 years in that sector and say, hey, why don't you come sharpen your skill so that you may be able to become better in your job? He will say, sir, as an untrained labor hand, I get much higher than the stipend that I'm going to get in any training institute. Even after I go get the certification, I'm not going to get any better of salary out there in the market because the market is completely chaotic, unorganized. Right? So he's making a rational choice every time not to go upskill himself.
So the bottom line is we have to be very, and by we, I mean the government, has to be very aware of its actions. And Shweta, I did really want to come to you and speak about startups, because I think that was another huge casualty of the pandemic. So many startups, looking at exciting futures, have just shut down. What can be done and what has been done to ensure that they get back on their feet?
So, Manika, I do have some good news to share here that while the first half of last year was terrible for the startup ecosystem, I think the data suggests that about 15% startups actually shut down. What we've seen happen at the end of 2020 is actually a very evident K-shaped recovery coming in startups. And I think if we notice which are the sectors that really did well, when we talk of the startup ecosystem, we talk of tech-based startups. And if you look at the kind of tailwinds that COVID gave to sectors like edtech, health tech, fintech, I mean, those are real areas that have actually come out stronger thanks to the pandemic. I mean, today look at a company like Byju's, which is a decacorn. It is the world's most valuable edtech company coming out of India. Now, those are success stories to celebrate. In fact, within the edtech space, you've got 2 unicorns, which is both Byju's and Unacademy. And in fact, India ended the year with 37 unicorns. So 11 new unicorns added in the pandemic year, 2020, when we saw 11 new unicorns getting added. So I speak for startups because that is one area where we can see real job generation happening. When you look at companies that are truly employing people. I talked to Byju's. Now, there are hundreds and thousands of teachers that are coming on board to teach and understanding and how to deliver education online. So I think tech and digital has touched every sector in a way that it's no longer about startups or about technology. It is something that even MSMEs are talking about today. The only way you can expect SMEs to recover from the pandemic is if they adopt digital, if they go digital. And I think that's the kind of trend that we're seeing. We have startups like Khata Book, Pagar Book that are totally digitizing the MSME space. You're talking about digital ledgers, you're talking about, online, taking everything. So I think it's very important that we see the government focus a lot around the kind of gains Digital India as a theme and an initiative for the government can actually bring to the sector in real. So I think one of the panelists touched upon internet access, device access. I think those are areas which are very low hanging fruit that the government can continue to focus on, but will lead to real benefits like job creation and others. The one other, I think, huge policy unlock that I'd like to talk about for the startup ecosystem, very often in India, we say that, why isn't, despite the entrepreneurial energy and talent that we see in India is the 3rd largest startup ecosystem in the world, but why aren't we creating the Googles and the Amazons and the Facebooks of the world from India? And I think the one answer to that, which we're really hoping the budget will address this year, is to allow unlisted companies to list on overseas exchanges. So just to help you understand this, today, an Indian startup doesn't have a level playing field with a global startup because they cannot list on a NASDAQ or an NYSE, because the current rules do not allow you to do that. But imagine if you allow that and unlock that policy initiative, which we understand that the government is in advanced stages of allowing. I mean, that will be the single biggest policy unlock for the sector, because today the kind of capital you'll be able to access by listing on overseas exchanges and bring back all that money to India, create more jobs, have more growth coming in for the sector. I mean, that'll have a spiral impact on job creation. And we're seeing specific sectors respond very, very positively. And this has been really tailwinds that you've got in the pandemic for many of these tech-driven sectors. And I think we should ride that wave.
Right. And, you spoke about stock exchanges, and I do want to take now questions from our audience. And I've got this question where someone has said that, it's been a year where there's been such economic slowdown, but why is the stock market so exuberant in the middle of this pandemic? Is there a disconnect between the real economy and the stock market? Yamini, Shweta, Mr. Gill?
So I don't know the Indian stock market at all, so I shouldn't try to answer that question. I did have sort of general points about the budget now, back to the budget, and I think it's sort of first point I think is that I think that it's very important for the finance minister to not try to offset one wrong, which was essentially a bad lockdown with a bad budget, in the sense that don't come up with a big bang lockdown. Don't try to offset a big bang lockdown, which wasn't implemented well, with a big bang budget. Okay. So the first thing that I think that she should actually focus much more on budget execution along the lines of what Yamini said and so on. And there, I think one of the problems that India is facing is that after the scrapping of the Planning Commission, India does not have a mechanism by which it can help the poorer states do good planning and do good budget execution. So the thing that the Planning Commission used to do was to actually help some of the poorer states put forward a good plan, right? That function is not being fulfilled by anybody right now. It's not Niti Aayog and so on. And Niti Aayog knows that, right? So that's one thing. So focus much more on the execution rather than on the allocation, because I don't think the problem is on the allocations. The second one, I think, it has to do with get foreign investment. There's so much money abroad, okay? You have to start to sort of think about changes within India, especially when it comes to state-owned enterprises. I'm talking about the LIC, I'm talking about the railways, I'm talking about Air India, you name it, right? Basically, I think that you have there is so much money. It's just not in India, and there's no reason why India shouldn't be attracting that.
Mr. Gill, do you think the politics, I just wanted to actually come in, do you think the politics of today will allow government to open up the likes of LIC and all to foreign investment?
So that's my third point. And I think the real problem here is there's a trust deficit, right? I think that the government has been following a pro-business, a pro-big business policy. And I think what it needs to explicitly do is to institute a competition policy where it puts some distance between itself and these big industrial houses, especially in the area of banks and things like that, but also in other things. And I think there is a serious problem. That's part of the reason why the Farm Bill, which I thought was a good bill, which had been debated for decades and so on, the reason why it didn't happen was because there was a distrust that this was something that was being done for the big industrial houses. So I think for all of these reasons, I think that much of the action will not really be in the budget itself. It will be in these other things. And I think that one of the things that the government should learn is that it's not very good at big bang reforms. It should stop doing them.
Well, we're already 1 hour into it, so I just want to now quickly go around the table. And Mr. Gill has started the process. So, Ram, if I can come to you next. The one thing that you would like to see, well, if not in the budget, because, we're talking about economic reforms and changes through the year, that you would like to see in 2021 and see the government do?
I think, like we've all discussed, there are too many points to be placing forward right now. One single thing, it's very difficult to pinpoint on one single thing. But definitely, I would say to concentrate more on employment generation, and things are interconnected to this. Let's say the manufacturing sector or even the service sector has been neglected for some time now, so it needs to be back on track. And Narega has been helping with the employment generation through the pandemic. And I've a couple of speakers have already mentioned about the urban side of the Manrega. So definitely, I would like to see some sort of discussion happening or some sort of indication happening in the budget this time, so that, that's again connected to the migration problem that we have. So employment generation kind of has everything related to health, education, and the manufacturing. So everything is, I kind of see that's somewhere common point that we can arrive with all the things that we have. So I would definitely say the budget should probably do a priority consideration of handling the employment. Yeah.
Yamini, you next. And I also wanted to ask you, this is a question from our audience, that do you think that universal basic income will help alleviate poverty?
Thanks. So I think that we have consistently in our COVID post-lockdown COVID relief recovery approach, conflated relief recovery with reform. At a time when an exogenous shock hits an economy, I'm not entirely convinced that this is the time for opportunities to be converted into crises to be converted into opportunity. This is the time for credibility, stability, and most crucially, immediate relief. And I think that's where our response has actually faltered quite substantially. So I think that what we need to do right now, I agree, this should be a low expectation budget. It should be a budget that is aiming to steady the ship. Don't forget, we entered the pandemic with an economy that was already hitting a very serious slowdown. There's many deep reforms that the Indian economy needs to confront. I would like to say this is not the moment for those deep reforms. Right now, what we need is a bit of a sort of a new deal, so to speak, one that does more on ensuring a social safety net so that the challenge of inequality doesn't get even sharper than it already is. And here there can be a lot of experimentation and innovation that is already on the table and is being debated, including an urban NREGA, potentially also cash transfers. I think that the arguments about universal basic income versus employment program, all of those are technical debates that we must have. I have views on those too. But right now, what we really need is a commitment to generous social protection in order to be able to get past the challenge of the pandemic, as well as a commitment to public infrastructure, capex, improving capex. Don't forget, government expenditure, public expenditure actually went down at a time when it should have gone significantly up. And so improve. And here again, this is where the reforms need to be had. So the fact that you have a large number of projects that are still not that are delayed, where payments have been delayed, where implementation bottlenecks have come, put in those public administrative reforms right now, and you will automatically see reform, you will automatically see relief and recovery, which is what the economy needs for this year, and then perhaps charting out a course for deeper reforms, and those will require a very different set of institutional shifts, including, as Indermit really rightly pointed out, the vacuum left behind of the Planning Commission having gone and the Niti Aayog coming in, and the federal challenge that we confront in a big way.
Right, Shweta?
Apologies, Manika, I missed the last question.
I was just saying that the one change, whether in the budget or in the coming year, since we've all sort of, defined the fact that the budget doesn't need to be this big bang thing where everything is included. We can have reforms or policies and, adapt through the year. So what is the one thing in 2021 that you would like to see change?
Well, growth, and more focus on growth. So I think, Manika, I know it's something that we say before every budget we talk about it, but that remains the bedrock. And it's always hard to deliver on that promise. But at the end of the day, a lot of the welfare schemes, a lot of the other issues that we're talking about cannot be resolved till we don't create jobs, till we don't spur growth, till we don't foster innovation. So whatever has been done is welcome, but it's still not enough to ensure that an economy of our size, an economy of the kind of challenges that we face is back on the growth path, because we simply cannot afford to have the kind of growth numbers that we saw. And while it was all a hit due to the pandemic, I think a lot can be done rather quickly, that we can move back on that growth path. So I think single-minded focus on delivering those growth numbers.
Nidhi, to you, and I know you've said you're not a budget expert, but I did want to ask you, as someone who's covered politics and national affairs for a long time, there've been a lot of recent developments at the border, and one of the questions from one of our attendees is that, again, with the politics of the day, will there be pressure again to increase the defense budget?
Well, I don't know whether that's politically linked or not. I mean, frankly, as a journalist all these years, it's appalling to see that often our soldiers at the border don't have the most basic equipment, and not just at the border, but even our forces in sensitive states, are struggling with winter equipment, for example, etc. So I think that's something that the government needs to address on a priority basis. In any case, I mean, there's so many things we want the government to do, and I think all of us sitting here today have had this long wish list for what we want. I think Professor Gill and Yamini Aiyar have really summed up the main points very well. I only want to say, as a parting shot, about this whole idea of an Atmanirbhar Bharat and self-reliant India, that I hope that in all the talk of this, we don't end up becoming a closed economy, and that license Raj doesn't sort of come back, where we're going to be questioned now for every chocolate that we bring back from abroad, etc. That's not. We don't want to go back to the 70s and 80s. That's not what we want to become either. So I just hope that Atmanirbhar Bharat doesn't make us into this sort of very protectionist economy either. And that's a sort of a more long-term policy vision. But by and large, everything that Professor Gill and Yamini Aiyar and Shweta have also sort of said in terms of a wish list, I think no one can disagree with that.
I just had visions of all of us holding chocolate, but Bharat.
Okay, so two things I would do more of, because I wouldn't say change. One is to the points made by the previous panelists. We are in a very difficult year. We need to survive before we can thrive. But in order for us to do that, I would invest in things that would give me quick returns. Because if I invest in things that take me a long time, the economy may not survive until then. So investing more in areas that give quick returns would be one thing that I would do more of in this budget. And the other is ensuring that the long-term wealth generators don't die in the meanwhile. So assuming that you're looking at a 2 or 3 year horizon, in those 2 or 3 years, whoever are your cash cows for the next 10, 20 years, ensure that they don't die. Because if you're saying small and medium enterprises are the backbone of the economy, and then because of whatever you're doing in the next 2, 3 years, if they don't survive, for an entire generation of entrepreneurs in the small and medium scale to come up around the country is going to be almost impossible. So doing those two things, I think, would give us enough time to ensure that we do the welfare and keep people fed and alive, and then the economy can then really take off after that.
Sridhar, and then you, Prateek.
I will just go on the maximum governance piece, and I think I have one more idea. I believe is a very big enabler. Most of Indians think of interaction with government as running from pillar to post. Now, can we change this running from pillar to post with probably one good 2 to 4 year investment, where the government will build an accountability framework that no matter where you are, if you want a birth certificate, you just come into one location and then request it, right? And we will figure out whatever is it to be done, whether it's the state government, the central government, the local government. Just this one portal where I just come in and say that I need a service, and the central government will spearhead this by making all the changes that are required in different state and regional laws to make sure that we give timely delivery of service. The right to public service delivery as well as doorstep delivery of services have been two great innovations that have been pioneered by one North Indian state and one South Indian state. Karnataka government has today listed 1,000 services, public services, where they give you a time guarantee, and they also give you a step-by-step process in which you can get this. and the timelines for this. Delhi government has pioneered giving services at the doorstep, right? If you can bring both of these together and begin by doing all non-budgetary intense services, birth certificate, ration card, X, Y, Z, and if you can just make this running around taken away from so many of Indians' lives, that's a great redeeming factor. The bigger things can wait. If it needs money to be given to somebody and all of those things, those can wait. But at least running from pillar to post, can we get away with that?
Making it easier. Prateek.
So I'll sort of circle back to the points I was talking about before. I think the biggest challenge is how do we ensure our children get back to school, right? The digital divide is real. The government needs to be cognizant of this digital divide. The urban population, even though had access to phones, had access to your Zoom, and you had children who were studying online. I mean, it's possible college education can be given, school education can be given in urban centers, but large chunks of our population has wasted a year of education, right? It's only K-12. Out of K-12, if you've lost one, almost 8 to 10% of your education is gone down the drain. Now that is going to have long-term effects. If we are not able to get vaccination done quickly and immune our rural population, we will waste another year of education. And I think as it is in a country where education is a necessity, just like food, in order to survive and thrive, I think wasting another year of education is totally not on the cards. Government needs to invest rapidly in building tech infrastructure so that rural populations, at least semi-urban population to start off with, has access to computers, has access to internet, right? And at the same time, we need to ensure that the marginalized don't get further marginalized. So we need to sort of be empathetic, as Bharat was saying, to the most marginalized section, to the vulnerable girls who have the risk of going back into child labor, child trafficking, and child marriage, and sort of ensure that they're cushioned off during this crisis. So a lot of, as Shweta said, growth. I would say development. I think these are the two pillars where each government struggles with to ensure growth, or go for big businesses and go big bang, or ensure welfareism. I think both of them need to work together. So if we are getting growth, we need to shout development as well on the other side, and that's something which I would want to do.
Well, the finance minister has said that this budget will be made in a manner never seen in 100 years in India. Thank you all so much for being here today. Let's hope the budget brings relief. It brings a little smile to the faces of many of those in this country who need it, and something that hopefully, we've never seen in 100 years before, even if it's not a big bang budget, small reforms, but something that helps those who really need it. Thank you so much to all my panelists and everyone for attending. Thank you.